Well, thank you all. Appreciate you coming out this morning. It's good to see you. It's quite a long bio. Maybe next year you can have me back. I can talk about Presbyterian polity and how to conduct properly Presbyterian meetings. That'd be a good 9 a.m. topic. Well, it is good to be with you. When I first agreed to give this talk a while back, I didn't realize it would be for the teen pre-conference. I thought it was, adults and, men and women. And then a couple weeks ago, I think it was one of my kids or somebody told me, hey, I'm not sure it's for adults. I think maybe it's for teens. And I'm like, what? And so I go look it up. Lo and behold, I'm speaking at the teen pre-conference. So that's a problem. I did a first draft outline, and now all my references to the 80s and Ronald Reagan probably won't land right. So sorry about that. Okay, I did do a second draft. So the issue for us to tackle this morning that Caleb asked me to speak about is why Christians need philosophy. Why Christians need philosophy. So I want to spend some time trying to make the case to you this morning that Christians do need philosophy and try to talk about what the value of philosophy is. But at the outset, we should note that that topic involves a very strong term. Need is a strong term. Why Christians need philosophy. That's a very strong claim. Right? I need some cotton candy. Do you need it or do you just want it? Maybe this morning, I need some coffee. Right? Do you need it or do you just want it? Right? I need to stay up till midnight. Do you need it or do you just want it? Obviously, in one sense, the only things we need, in one shallow sense, the only things that we need are water, food, and shelter. So there's a kind of pedantic dope who will always ask, do you need that or do you only want it? Right? Maybe your younger brother finally gets that phrase in his head and then he says it for the rest of the week. But the pedant is usually wrong, and in this case, the pedant misses the bigger picture, of course. You don't last very long with only food and water. You need affection, you need family, you need friends, you need a community, a neighborhood, a country, and all the things that go into that. So let's admit out of the gate, we don't need philosophy like we need water or air. We won't die tomorrow without it. But there are other notions of need that go beyond the shallow sense. In that sense, we don't need music. Right? Did we need to start with the song this morning? In that shallow sense, we don't need art. We don't need beautiful architecture. We don't need to travel to foreign countries or to other states. Does anyone need to see the Grand Canyon? We don't need to study history. We don't need to learn to can tomatoes or husband chickens ourselves. We don't even need the Bible in that sense. Would you die tomorrow if the Bible disappeared? Okay, that's a weird question. We're in the realm of weird questions. Perhaps what immediately comes to mind with that question is Jesus in the desert answering Satan, saying, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. There are things that sustain us beyond the mere physical. There are things that we aim at well beyond the mere physical. Okay, so let's think about this more soberly and not with an overly restrictive understanding of need. Let's think about need in a more complete sense. So my claim I'll try to press on you this morning is that Christians do need philosophy like we need history and art. We need philosophy like an apple tree needs a wise gardener, not just to live, but to be fruitful the way that it ought to be. We need it in order to be complete as God intended us to be, to glorify Him and for us to be joyful and happy in Him. So that's going to be the argument. Now, how is this going to go? How does philosophy contribute to God's glory and the happiness of man? I will give you reasons and argument, as you would no doubt expect at this point, but I want to first dispel some misconceptions. I can imagine at the outset, perhaps some of you are skeptical. Certainly, I know many would be. So, let's start with an example. And here I have to admit an old people reference continued in the talk. During the 2016 Republican presidential primaries, philosophy made an appearance. This was kind of a big deal for philosophy. Philosophy doesn't really get a lot of like good airtime in any kind of broader cultural moment. We're not usually on Fox News or whatever, right? Philosophy is usually, in the side closet. We don't try to talk about that. So it made it onto the Republican presidential primary stage. This was nearly as big a stage for philosophy as when Taylor Swift revealed she was taking philosophy courses online, right? That's a true story. Anyone remember that? Yeah, there's like 3 of you. Thank you. Okay, right. Her new album, right, has a very nice philosophy reference, right? You know how to ball. I know Aristotle. Right? Don't listen to that album. Actually, it's terrible. Even that song is horrible. But again, philosophy doesn't have many moments, right? So we take what we can find in the pop culture. I'm not sure Aristotle would be proud of that. So back to the real example. The real example came from Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. He's still senator now. He said at the presidential primary debates in 2015, "We need more welders and less philosophers." We need more welders and less philosophers. Now, your immediate reply to that should be fewer. We need more welders and fewer philosophers, right? Okay, all right. So having said that, right, what was Rubio's point? Why would he say we need welders and not philosophers? Well, he said this because of what philosophers today have become. Philosophers today have become one of 2 things: pointy-headed nerds in ivory towers, or avant-garde activists bent on transforming society. The one is irrelevant and the other is dangerous. The nerds in the ivory towers are broadly irrelevant. Their day job is to work on technical minutia and generally hold down a bureaucratic job where they pretend to teach logic to 18-year-olds and the 18-year-olds pretend to learn it. If you go to the University of Idaho, that meets the description of a lot of what passes for philosophy. It's unfortunate, but it's what it looks like. These kinds of philosophers are banal, if expensive, quite expensive. The activists, on the other hand, are a very different story. In the late 19th century, philosophy turned peculiarly political. The philosopher Karl Marx famously asserted that the philosophers of the past have all sought to understand the world, but the point is to change it. And change it they have. The Marxist ideology, according to which all of mankind is divided into oppressors and oppressed, and therefore that revolution is now mandatory, has torn apart nation after nation. It's tearing our nation apart right now. And in other nations, it's led to poverty and mass killing on an almost unfathomable scale. The deaths from communism in Soviet Russia, Maoist China, number in the tens of millions. Altogether, certainly more than 100 million deaths in the last century. So the Marxist activists and their descendants today are not merely amusing, irrelevant nerds. They are deadly dangerous. The aspiration of communism was that all of human life could be scientifically and rationally managed, so as to eliminate poverty and exploitation altogether. Although if you read Marx, he defined any kind of profit-making enterprise as inherently exploitative, right? So this destroys economic activity as a whole. In a milder form, many in the West have been taken in by this idea of a total scientific management of life. Early 20th century progressivism in the US and Western Europe thought the same thing. Even in groups today that are not taken in by collectivism, we can look at the libertarians or the classical liberals, they have bought into a kind of modern abstraction of their own, individualism. The modern philosophers, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, begin their accounts of humanity with a state of nature. You might have been forced to read about this in high school at some point, perhaps, or you will be. A state of nature. The state of nature for Hobbes and Locke is populated with fully formed individuals who are then free to create whatever associations they like and to reject any associations they don't like. They start out as individuals. This is its, I argue, its own kind of modern abstraction. And true philosophy has the antidote to both of these contemporary political mistakes, distinguishing utopian political systems from realistic and truly just ones. That's how political philosophers have done it up until Marx. Recognizing also that man is a social and political animal, not isolated in a state of nature, but communal from the very beginning. Everyone comes into the world through a mom and a dad, a community. Everyone is always in a community with God. God is personal and inescapable. Okay, so I want to get back to the main thread here. We can understand Senator Rubio's skepticism about philosophy because philosophers today are not a force for good in typical cases. Right? If they're just rabble-rousers or spongers, we can see why we would want fewer of them. Welders, on the other hand, have no delusions of grandeur. They just faithfully create stuff that we need for a comfortable life. Does society even need philosophy, let alone Christians? Okay, so you might think I'm not doing too well in this talk. The talk is supposed to be about why Christians need philosophy, and so far you're probably not convinced. So we'll try to improve on that. But those are the reasons why I think there can be a lot of skepticism toward philosophy. There could be other reasons. Those are some of the reasons. Okay, fast forward from 2015 to 2018, and Senator Rubio tweeted something different. This was on March 28, 2018. You can look it up. It's still up on his Twitter feed. Rubio tweeted this 3 years later. I made fun of philosophy 3 years ago, but then I was challenged to study it. So I started reading the Stoics. I've changed my view on philosophy, but not on welders. We need both. Vocational training for workers and philosophers to make sense of the world. So that's quite the change of heart for Senator Rubio. It's a big turnaround. He goes from saying we need fewer of them, to saying, actually, they're great and we need both. I've changed my view. Why would he have changed his view? I actually don't know why. I don't know who talked to him. Somebody got to him, which is great, but I don't know who got to him. Somebody got to him. But he's clearly hearkening back to a much older idea of philosophy, hence his reference to the Stoics 2,000 years ago. He's clearly hearkening back to something that philosophy was and could be again. And it's that kind of philosophy that Senator Rubio warmed up to, and it's that kind of philosophy, I'll argue, that provides a valuable service to the church. What is that philosophy as it was done and as it could be done again today? In the broadest sense, it's this: the use of our God-given minds to understand the fundamental structures of the created world and to better understand God himself. And that this activity is not proud autonomy, but is the expression of humble Christian obedience. So let me ask you this. Where's the first example of philosophy in the Bible? Where's the first example? What's the biblical justification for philosophy, if there is one? And I'm not talking about the word philosophy. That word actually does show up in the Greek in one place in the New Testament, the book of Colossians. You can look it up. But the example of doing philosophy, not the word, but the thing. Right, where does it show up? What's the biblical justification for it, if there is one? Well, the justification for doing philosophy as Christians, I would argue, originates in Genesis 1, right at the beginning. Genesis 1. You know the passage. You know the creation of the world in 6 days, God resting on the seventh. You know the creation of man and woman on day 6. And I want to recall the account of their creation, and I'm going to read a couple verses now, and ask you to notice what God told man after he made them. Right? You might already know this, but think about it again as you hear it. What did God tell man after he made them? So this is Genesis 1, starting at verse 26. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God made man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed, to you it shall be for meat, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, to every thing that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat, and it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good, and the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Okay, you know the story, and you know the task. God made man to work the garden, to subdue the wild earth and make it all orderly, beautiful, and fruitful like the garden in Eden. God made man to rule and to govern the earth, everything given into man's hand. So man and woman govern as kings and queens under the King of Kings. Everything in creation is given into our hands for our use, for our life, and so that we should bring it to its fullness under God. Right? Only a small part of the created earth was the actual garden. There was all this stuff outside that was supposed to be brought into order. And so that was the task. In Genesis 2, we have a more specific, detailed account of the creation of man and woman on day 6. And when God creates man, it says that he put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. It's verse 15 of chapter 2. To dress it and keep it. The dressing is a cultivating, a working, a tilling, right? To cultivate the garden. The keeping is a guarding it, a caring for it. The keeping is the maintaining of it in its safety and in its well-being. So you have on the one hand the shovel for cultivating and the sword for guarding. A sword for cutting down the wild places, allowing the shovel to cultivate the earth even further. This is the original vocation of man. And so I ask again, what's the first example of philosophy in the Bible? What's the biblical justification? Think about this activity in Genesis 2. Right. After describing the creation of man, his place in the garden, this mandate to dress and keep, what is the first act of dominion that we see Adam do? What's the first action that Adam takes? Right? What's the work that he does in Genesis 2? Right? You know this story as well. It's the naming of the animals. The naming of the animals. There's one recent book on Genesis that calls this a kind of funny scene, as if it's some kind of zoo humorous scene in Genesis 2 where all the animals come to Adam and it's kind of funny or something. I don't know what that author's thinking. This is like the most serious, amazing thing ever. Anyway, I want to dwell on this passage just for another moment in Genesis 2, looking at what Adam does and what it means, looking at this naming of the animals and this activity, because it's here, I'm going to argue, we see philosophy happening in Genesis 2. Right? God, of course, tells him not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then says that it's not good for man to be alone. And so in order to show Adam his aloneness and his need for the woman, God walks Adam through an intellectual exercise, one that uses Adam's natural endowments applied to the natural world. And all the different animals come before Adam, and Adam names them. Does God tell Adam the names? Does he tell him the names? Does he say, this is a giraffe, and this is a bee, and so on and so forth? Does God spoon feed Adam the names, give him a cheat sheet? Here's your cheat sheet. Here's your study guide. Study the names. He doesn't. He doesn't. He brings the animals to Adam, and Adam decides what their names are. Adam has to figure out what to call them. Right? That would not have been easy the first time around. Did Adam create the animals? Obviously not. Did Adam make the animals what they are? No. Did Adam give the animals their own distinct natures? No. What did Adam do? He looked at what God has made. He saw what they are, recognized the natural distinction between different kinds of beings, and called them by fitting names. The first act of dominion, of this exercise of dominion, was an intellectual act of taxonomy, of recognizing distinctions, of saying, this is not that, this is different, we should use this word for it. This is what it is. Now, this activity was not merely biology, as you might be thinking. Of course, until 200 years ago, what we call biology was considered a part of philosophy, natural philosophy, the part of philosophy that studies nature. Biology wasn't its own thing in the way that we do it now until very recently. Biologists do grasp being, the being of living things. Biology even gets a certain eminence among the natural sciences, since life itself has an eminence among other material things. It is very interesting that the first kind of scientific enterprise is biological on Adam's part. Right? Biology is also kind of the coolest science because it studies things which can move themselves. And that's pretty amazing that some things in the world can move themselves. Other things have to be moved by something else. Living things have an internal principle of motion whereby they can be a source of their own motion. And that's very cool. So when you see Dr. Gordon Wilson around, you can tell him I went to bat for biology. Okay. Physics is cool too. No knock on physics. Still, it's not biology or physics that gives shape to the whole picture. It's philosophy that gives shape to the whole picture. The principles of sound distinctions in biology are the principles of sound distinctions in other areas. And to know a thing properly, the way you'd want to know it biologically even, or in physics or in other fields of knowledge, to know a thing is to understand its nature, its causes, and its ends. That's true in biology and it's true in other fields as well. It's not just knowing here's the little bits of matter that make it up, but it's knowing what it is, what its causes are, and what its ends are. That is what it takes to adequately know something in creation. Adam saw the distinctions between the living things, but he also saw what they were for, what their purposes and ends were, their goals. He could see not only that they had different colors and shapes, but different structures and natural ends. And to cut to the point, he could see that none of the animals was a helper suitable for him. Right? None of them could do or accomplish the end that needed to be accomplished. None of them could be his partner, not only for procreation, but also for the activities of ruling and reigning, of cultivating and keeping. For that, there needed to be a different creature. So, of course, in Genesis 2, God puts Adam to sleep, takes a rib from his side, and creates Eve. And then, just like the animals, he brings her to Adam. And just as before, God doesn't tell Adam what it is, or this time who it is, and doesn't tell Adam what it means. But still, Adam can see. He grasps the significance right away. He sees not only a biological difference in matter or material structure between Eve and the other animals, but a difference in meaning and purpose, a difference in what it means, a difference in being and a difference in ends. And so he says, she is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She receives a name from the man, and the name reflects her closeness to him. He is Ish and she is Isha. Those are the Hebrew terms there for man and woman, Ish and Isha. She is like him, but she is not him. She is a fitting or suitable helper who shares his nature and yet also differs from his nature in some way. And Adam sees this. He grasps it with his mind. And he spouts forth poetry and biology and philosophy all at once in a way that cements these two people together. This is not merely biology happening. This is a high and glorious thing. And you know what happens next. The two become one flesh. What was distinguished and separated is now reunited. This is not just a blob of matter. This is something to cling to forever. So no, this is not just biology in Genesis 2. This is something much, much bigger. And the only word we have in English I would submit to you to capture the picture of what's happening here, and I'm sure the poets would come argue with me and the literary people would argue with me and so forth, but I put before you, we should think of this as philosophy. An insight into nature and essences, using words to distinguish things, drawing the appropriate inferences, responding and feeling and acting in the appropriate way, all to the glory of God and the building up of his church. Now, let me say something more about science, since biology is like the main rival, I think, interpretation to the activity I've described in Genesis 2. I want to knock science down a bit for a moment. So far from being mere science, philosophy provides important limits for science. Philosophy provides important limits for science. This is actually one of the important functions of philosophy. I'll try to come around as we work through this here. Right, philosophy provides important limits for science. Natural science is actually very poor at providing its own limits, at understanding itself. To take some easy examples from the past, there are the ethical boundaries that science is not always good at observing. To take an extreme case of science gone awry, we can think of the famous and horrifying cases of the Nazi scientists who used Jews as scientific test subjects. Right? Horrific ethical violation. Today, closer to home, we can think of the body mutilation caused by transgender surgical operations. We can do it scientifically. Why not do it? What's the limit? There's no internal principle there that limits it. Think of our deepest national stain, abortion, right? Enabled by science that doesn't know its limits. It's all very scientific and clinical, but it's deeply horrifying. So the ethical limitations of scientific inquiry, places we shouldn't go, experiments we shouldn't conduct, must come to science from the outside. Right? There's no biological technique that will tell you where to stop applying that biological technique. Right? You need to bring in ethical insight from outside of biology itself. One more example of the need for philosophy to inform and limit science. Consider the mantra that arose during the now, thankfully not quite as recent pandemic, the mantra that we ought to follow the science. Follow the science. There are always steps that we could take to follow the science and reduce the number of lives lost. We could all wear N95 masks everywhere we go. That would reduce the number of communicable diseases we acquire. We could all wear helmets when we wake up. This would reduce the number of traumatic head injuries. We could get rid of all pools. That would reduce the number of drownings. We could save a lot of lives if we just ban pools. Follow the science. Right? I mean, the science is right. If you banned pools, you'd have fewer drownings, you'd have fewer deaths. But what science cannot do is balance its conclusions with anything else. It can't tell us what it means or how it fits with the rest of the world. It can't tell us which risks are worth it. It can't tell us what other goods we might be giving up for some safety or security that it's able to describe for us at a biological level. And so, of course, several years after COVID, we see that there was a lack of prudence, a lack of wisdom that was manifest in so many directives that were thought to be merely following the science. Right? The science couldn't interpret itself. The science couldn't see the bigger picture. It's prudence that must weigh all the goods and judge the right course. Prudence must take the reports from the scientist and balance it with everything else that we know and everything else that we pursue. Prudence is an intellectual virtue, a virtue of the mind. It's not merely a scientific insight. And where is prudence developed? Not through scientific technique. From Scripture, certainly, that's an important component of it. Scripture lived out through the experience of life. Reflection on life. Learning from others who themselves are prudent and have seen a lot of things. This is properly philosophical training. To learn prudentially, to understand particular situations in light of eternal truths, to fit it with scientific knowledge and the ebb and flow of life, which is constantly changing. The book of Proverbs, reflects this kind of practical wisdom, although it doesn't pursue it systematically. Since Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, philosophers have insisted that true wisdom is not merely technical knowledge. The ability to manipulate little bits of matter, like an engineer or an economist, is not the same as understanding what the thing is, what we ought to do, and why we ought to do it. I think those who were steeped in political philosophy from the West, the way it used to be done, were the ones that were least likely to fall for the dictum, follow the science. They knew that science was not prudence and could not replace prudence in human life. Right? I'm making out philosophy to be something quite good now, right? Something quite different. It's now come around to mean the rational and courageously rational pursuit of wisdom and prudence. You may know the word philosophy itself means love of wisdom, phileo sophia. And the drawing of distinctions is a core part of that love of wisdom. The drawing of distinctions enables an understanding of what each thing is, the understanding of its being, its truth, and reality. To look at it, to break it apart, to put it back together, to understand its nature, not merely as a physical thing, but what it is and what it is for, and what God intends it to be. And so recall again Senator Rubio's comment, right? There has been a thread here, where he proposed vocational training for workers and philosophers to make sense out of the world. Philosophers try to make sense out of the world, and the good ones have followed that trail right to God. Okay, so if you're still with me, indulge me in one more trip down history's lane to talk about a little bit of philosophy from the past, and then we'll be wrapping things up here. Right. Caleb mentioned that I work on ancient Greek philosophy. This is the time period in history where philosophy began. The first philosophers sought to give an explanation or a rational explanation of the whole. It's the word they used, the whole, the everything. They didn't do a great job of it, but they did make some significant advances over the older mythological understandings that the Egyptian and Greek mythologies had that weren't very good. If you've read Homer or Hesiod, you know some of those mythological histories, which have very interesting ethical components to them, but certainly as any kind of explanation of where everything came from, they are pretty poor. The earliest philosophers knew that there was an order behind things that was more rational and universal than the local gods would suggest. Zeus's divine justice, the fates that were the even deeper magic, had to be recast in a more intellectual and sensible fashion. And so the Apostle Paul says that the Greeks seek wisdom, searching for this order in the universe, the whole, so they could know it and live harmoniously with it. The Stoics, who arrived later as followers of Socrates, had their own slogan that we should live in conformity with nature, that the goal of knowing the world was to live harmoniously with it, to integrate not just our ideas, but our whole lives. Philosophy seeks that kind of integrated, holistic understanding of the world, where every part is related to every other part and to its source. In actual historical fact, what this search has meant, this search for origins, for an explanation of the integrated whole, for a rational picture, what this meant was the absolute triumph of Jesus Christ over all traditions of men which stood against the Messiah. That's, in historical fact, what happened with philosophy. The earliest philosophers, the schools that developed from them, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, they all either became absorbed into Christianity, fulfilled in Christianity, transformed by Christianity, or they disappeared altogether. Right? There's not really any Neoplatonists anymore today running around. Right? Either it gets transformed by Christianity and can survive as a version of Christianity, or it's gone. And by 600 AD, that's what happens to all of them. Philosophy does not survive unscathed its encounter with Jesus, with the Word. The philosophers had their understandings transformed. We can see this from 100 AD forward with Justin Martyr, the first, often considered the first Christian apologist. He wore the toga of a philosopher. There's accounts of this. And he became a Christian. Okay, so the syllogism goes like this. If we want to obey God and fulfill the nature he gave us at creation, we must cultivate our minds and seek intellectual dominion. If we want to cultivate our minds and seek intellectual dominion, we must do philosophy. QED. Why do Christians need philosophy? Because God gave us minds capable of understanding his world. We need to develop that capacity to understand our world if we are to properly love and praise its maker, if we are to properly tend and keep it, if we are to wield the shovel and the sword. Thank you.